Doug and Stephanie, first of all, I want to thank you for organizing this symposium. This is really a symposium that I think is at the heart of a lot of the issues with wildlife and wildlife management in the public and science. You know, typically when the public has a debate about an issue and there's controversy about it, the first response of a scientist said, well, they just don't understand, we just need more science. And in reality, sometimes more science increases the polarization. And so I'm going to take you through a presentation about some of the things we've been involved in with wild horse and burros. And to start it off, I'd like to leave you with start a quote with George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw said one time that I wrote it down here so I can remember it. A life spent making mistakes is more honorable and useful than a life spent doing nothing at all. So when you hear this presentation, take that to heart. So anyway, okay, and I made where are we at? Where's the toggle at? Oh, there we go. Well, here's kind of a roadmap of what we're going to talk to, and basically it's a story about the public, a story about wildlife management. And again, wild horse and burros are not wildlife. Okay, from the standpoint, wild horse and burros are defined by the 1971 Act. It says basically all horses, free-roaming horses and burros, and their descendants that existed on designated areas at the time the legislation was passed are considered wild and free-roaming, okay? And that covers burros and horses. Now, if you look at tribal lands, such as the Navajo Nation estimates they might have close to 60 to 7,000 horses and burros. Those horses and burros by tribal lands are considered feral, okay? And so the differences in the legislative definition, it's not necessarily, you know, it's where they occur at the time the legislation was passed. So anyway, here's something, you know, Celeste mentioned about the Act. And here's the 177 wild horse and burro management areas just on the BLM. This represents roughly a third of the free-roaming equids in the United States. In other words, 2/3 of the free-roaming equid population do not occur on BLM land. And so when we look at BLM areas, this is a slide that shows the number of areas above the appropriate management level. And so Celeste talked about that designation, 1978, I think is when it first happened. But you can see the coloration. Those in yellow are at or below the appropriate management level. Here's a slide I borrowed from the BLM, and it's pretty much self-explanatory about what the problem is. But the one I want you to focus on is really that public perception one. And that's really what this talk is all about, is the public perceptions of the program. The act was passed in 1971. How many in this room were born in 1971? How many of you wrote letters to support the Wild Horse and Burro Act in the 1960s? Come on, raise your hand. Okay, so anyway, the American mind is changing. You know, obviously we hear about the demographics. Had a great presentation in the plenary session where we talked about the word conservation. One of the speakers, conservation. It doesn't exist in native languages. Well, the word conservation means to work together. To work together. It's been somewhat, the definition's been changed and used for different particular purposes, but I like the definition that they provided, the talk about healing. Healing. When you think about conservation, healing that landscape. It's more beyond healing the landscape. When we look at conservation as we define it, most of that conservation is defined where? In the political marketplace. So it involves values, emotions, feelings. When Stephen Keller did a survey about animals in American society in the 1985, he did a whole series of surveys. Dogs were number one, horses were number two. Cats didn't make the top 10, I'm sorry, so if there's any cat folks in here. So, but anyway, we've got this demographic change. That's why I ask about the 1971, who was born in 1971 and who wasn't. Well, obviously, you know, if you're not 50 years old, you probably weren't born in 1971. And so the demographics are really shifting. And I look around this room, and there's a lot of young folks in this room. There are a lot of young folks at this particular conference. And so, as a baby boomer, you can thank me for the wild horse and burro problem, okay? No, but anyway, we've learned some interesting things about the zoonotic, about pandemic, okay? One of the things we learned about the pandemic is information and how information travels. Here's a study that was published subsequent to the pandemic about misinformation and the effect of social media on what people's perception is about science, okay? And so the response to this misinformation, we did what? We produced more science, more science, more science, and we kept feeding the public more science. Years ago, we did surveys about where the public gets information from. And at that time, most of the public got information from their friends, their family. Social media, right? Now it's electronic, it's digital, it's instantaneous. Okay, so that's an important thing. These are some slides that I borrowed from Dr. Frey's research. And again, it shows some of the things about what people think about native versus feral. Where do horses fit on that continuum? What about competition for resources? Here's a couple slides she's asked about, competition with native wildlife, competition with domestic animals, domestic livestock. And so you saw some fairly good sense of agreement. So there's recent studies published in the Journal of Wildlife Management, a special issue, which in fact show that there are some real concerns about areas that are dominated by wild horse and burros and no livestock grazing, particularly in the case of sage grouse, where we're having some significant impacts. Okay, wild horses and burros are out there 24/7. Domestic livestock are out there when we let them. We can take them, we can move them, and again, in these areas, because of their protection, because of the free roaming status, there's not that ability just to automatically just move them and change them. We do gathers, and those gathers are done where they're permanently removed from the range, and then some are actually returned to the range. So anyway, what about the idea of natural regulation? One of the questions that Dr. Fry asked is about who eats wild horses and burros? Can cougars eat their way to AML? Okay. An interesting study, interesting question response here about natural regulation. The public, in responding to Dr. Frey's survey, had this perception that nature works in balance. Let nature take care of it. Let nature take care of it. Okay, let the cougars do those types of things. Well, there's a recent article published that, yeah, cougars do. Again, out of the Journal of Wildlife Management, but they're specialists. They're specialists. If, in fact, cougars are going to regulate wild horse population, what part of the population do they need to remove? What part of the population do they need to remove? The mares. What part of the population are they specializing on? The foals, okay? So anyway, here's about free equid management. She asked another question about what public perceives about it. The BLM admits to be successful, all of these things have to be in place. And again, this is the idea of improving the public perception of the program. Understanding, developing programs, a wider public, reaching out to a wider group of audiences. Whenever I talk to somebody about wild horse and burros, free equid management, you know what my response is? Oh, excuse me, my phone's going off, I gotta take this call. That's the response I typically get. Because it's an uncomfortable issue. It's a biological issue, but it's more a sociological issue because it deals with the values, the emotions. So what we did is we put together a summit in 2017. And so that quote about mistake, remember that quote. Anyway, we thought this was a great summit. We had 250 people, 100 and some organizations represented, but we didn't include horse activists. And so what do you think the headline said? Okay. So we learned from the mistake. And so we were a little bit more strategic. We followed this up with another summit in Reno, Nevada, and we expanded the group, including tribal lands, First Nations, in the discussion. And so in addition to learning more and more about the topic, the focus of these summits, and we had another one, this is in Cody, Wyoming, This is called a pandemic summit, where we also learned how to go virtual. But the idea about these summits is that we started learning that what's more important than actually the science sometimes is stepping back and getting to know the other people that are involved in the process, understanding their fears, understanding their concerns, and getting to learn about who they are as people while we're trying to learn about the particular management issue. We just finished a summit up in St. George here just recently. And again, the focus of this summit was creating a safe place with discussion about science, discussion about human dimensions, discussion about emotions, values, and taking that and moving one step forward. It's about building relationships. Relationship building is hard work. If you are a wildlife biologist, ecologist, or conservation biologist, you need to put as much energy into building relationships as you do in building your science. This is a good issue to get your feet wet if you're interested. So here's some of the challenge, some of the opportunities. We've got a lot of work to do. The act was passed, it's 50 years old. And what's happened is we're keeping to kick the can down the road and letting those who follow deal with it. And we really can't do that. We can't do that. This is an issue about climate change. It's also an issue about One Health. This is an article we also published in the Journal of Wildlife Management. Kate and Sarah are here talking about the wildlife manager's role in this process. As the wildlife community, we can't dodge this issue. Just as we think about managing wild populations, we need to be concerned about wild horse and burros and how society interacts. And so the idea is thinking about One Health, focusing on not just the animals, the landscape, and the humans, but integrating them together. And so the word healing came out today in the plenary session. And ultimately, change. We can't have progress without change. And change is hard. What's the first thing you do when somebody says, oh, we've got to change that report. Oh, we got to do this. No. We get busy on the proof. And ultimately, resolution of wild horse and burro management in this country focuses on involving and building those relationships which are so integral and valuing those individuals. And I just got the big stop sign, and there's a big hook coming out. So anyway, thank you.